A mute cleaner who works in a hidden high-security government lab in 1960s America creates a bond with a new specimen, a mysterious scaled fishman. Guillermo Del Toro is a fascinating filmmaker with a really long filmography with quite a lot of variety in it. He's moved from making Spanish language films to making massive American blockbusters, and almost everything he's made is sort of an artifact of pop culture. It's filtered through other people's imagination as much as his own. In Crimson Peak, we have a gothic story that has its roots in his fascination with ghosts, death, and loneliness, but filtered through Hammer horror and the American International Pictures Edgar Allan Poe adaptations. With Pan's Labyrinth, a meticulously created fantasy world becomes the backdrop to a vicious cycle of violence in Franco's Spain. Even in Pacific Rim, a story about international cooperation and platonic friendship and family bonds ends up being filtered through giant monster and robot fights. Despite the variety in his filmography, there is a lot of common themes and visuals that recur throughout Guillermo del Toro's work. He's obsessed with monsters. They feature in almost all of his films, and yet they are almost always, if not sympathetic, at least understandable. He very rarely has a completely ferocious, totally evil creature in the centre of his films. Thinking about the ghosts in Crimson Peak and The Devil's Backbone, they are horrifying, but they're also there for very specific reasons. In Hellboy, the titular character and Abe Sapien to some extent are fighting against their nature and trying to be something else, even though they are essentially monstrous to everyone else's view. And there's often an infernal machine. There's a blood-sucking vampiric bit of clockwork at the heart of Kronos, or in Crimson Peak there's a giant clay excavation machine that completely distorts the lives of everyone around it. And underneath the obvious visual and story similarities, there's a lot of thematic similarities as well. He's obsessed with death and moving to other worlds, the power of stories and how the people who tell them and how they're told affect the people who hear them. And time recurs constantly throughout his films. The kids in The Devil's Backbone are waiting for soldiers to show up any day. In both Hellboy films, prophecy is a large part of the story. In the end, I adore Guillermo del Toro's work, not just because it is so consistently and thoroughly him. It is so much a production of his work and how he understands the world and what he sees it like, but also because, in a sense, I grew up as a filmmaker with Guillermo del Toro's work. In 2006, when Pan's Labyrinth came out, it was just when I was starting to really get into films in a serious way, and so I kind of grew along with his films and sort of saw him develop as a filmmaker as well. All of which brings us to The Shape of Water. It's been a critical darling. It's been released in the States a while back, and I keep getting people asking for it on the channel. I almost feel like this is going to be less of a review and more like my thoughts on the movie, if that makes any sense. The film is astonishingly good, and you should absolutely go and see it, and avoid spoilers as much as possible. Not because there's anything super twisty in the film, but because the sensuality of it and the power of its narrative relies on you having seen it firsthand. At the heart of it, it's a fairy tale, like a lot of his movies. In this case, it's about otherness. It's a story about learning to deal with difference in yourself and others. Sally Hawkins, playing a mute woman here, falls in love with someone who is not like anyone else that she will ever meet, and who actually can't speak as well. But what's impressive about the film is it doesn't just try and tell a story about otherness that is based off a sort of science fiction-y fantasy fable. You can see fables about otherness in science fiction all over the place. Star Trek has done loads of them. But one problem with doing that is that you sort of end up with these bizarre morals that maybe don't quite mean what you want them to. TV Tropes calls this the space whale Aesop, named after Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home, which is all about why we should save the whales. So the moral of the film is, yeah, you should save the whales, we should be doing more to protect the environment. But the actual moral of the plot of the film is we should save the whales because they are super important to an alien race that time travels in the future. Not like just save the whales because that's a good idea in general. When The Shape of Water talks about otherness, yes, its central story is about love between a woman and a fishman, but at the same time it grounds that in very real examples of how otherness has manipulated and damaged lives in lots of ways. There's a really powerful scene when Richard Jenkins' character finally sort of makes a come-on to the guy who works in a local diner that he likes. The guy not only rejects him, but also at the same time, two black people walk in and try to sit down, and he basically kicks them out of the shop. It's a reminder of the constant prejudice that a lot of people face still in their lives, but especially at that time. It's an example of Guillermo Del Toro taking a fantasy story about otherness and then pinning it to a very real and grounded example of exactly how otherness can be used, historically has been used, to hurt people. To take that moral and pull it out a bit, one of the most disarming things about the film is that it also turns its villain into a very complex character indeed. Michael Shannon plays this horrible G-Man character who is just incredibly, brutal, and yet the film makes him vulnerable in so many ways. It shows him ultimately as a failure of a sort of toxic masculinity born out of a 1950s machismo and a commercial buy-anything attitude. As much as the film is about Sally Hawkins embracing her own difference to the world and sort of learning to love someone whose difference is so astonishingly colossal that it's sort of incomprehensible even within the plot of the film, it's also about Shannon's character completely failing to accept otherness and trying to think of himself constantly as being the best, and how that completely destroys him. I've got to say that's very cool of Del Toro, and I love that the plot of the film essentially hinges on Michael Shannon being completely incapable of thinking that a black woman and a mute woman who work as cleaners in his facility are behind everything that goes wrong for him in the movie. Now, to go back to Del Toro, he talked about this film as being his first grown-up movie, a film that wasn't just riffs and references to other stuff that he liked, but was him going out into the world as a grown-up instead of, as he put it, like a child. I'm not sure that I completely buy that. The Shape of Water is an interesting movie in his filmography in the sense that it differs very much from his previous films. It has nowhere near as many edits, for instance, as his previous work does. It's prone to lots of long, sweeping, wide shots, which is, again, not much like most of the rest of what he's done. And yet, there's something very specifically Del Toro about everything in the film. Not just in its embracing of a lot of the tropes that he's used in the past. For one thing, one of the main characters is literally a monster. He's very, very close to, almost copyright infringingly close to being the creature from the Black Lagoon, which is a very strong influence on the film by Del Toro's own admission. His obsession with time also runs throughout the film. There's a lot of imagery around clocks. There's a calendar she has on her wall that becomes plot significant later on, which also has quotes written on the back of each day, including "Time flows like a river," right at the start of the movie. She also uses an egg timer for a sort of interesting purpose that recurs throughout the film. And there are a huge amount of references to other medias throughout the film. There's a lot of 1950s, 1960s TV constantly on, and real programs like Mr. Ed. Sally Hawkins and Richard Jenkins live in a little loft, I guess, above the projection room of a cinema. The cinema is named the Orpheum after Orpheus, who is the guy who went into the underworld in Greek mythology. So that's another little reference to a separate world for you there, for you Guillermo Del Toro watchers out there. The cinema itself seems to be like an externalized version of Sally Hawkins' subconscious. It constantly shows romantic films and biblical epics. In a sense, it seems to inform her inner life, just like the musicals that she watches with Richard Jenkins upstairs. Honestly, the weakest moment of the film, which is a musical number that serves very little narrative purpose, is based entirely on those references. So I don't think that Del Toro can really say this film isn't being filtered through other references. However, in a sense, it does feel very different to his other films. And in particular, I think that the focus on a female sexuality that's very powerful in this film is a really amazing departure, both for, I think, mainstream American cinema. I still can't believe in some ways this film is being talked about as an Oscar winner, but also for Del Toro himself. It's really not been something that he's exploring, so it's nice to see that despite all of his success and the size of some of the films that he's done since his early Spanish language stuff, he is still developing and growing as a filmmaker, and I think that's a really, really wonderful sight. When you go to see this movie, do it in the big screen. It is a gorgeous film. I saw Crimson Peak on the big screen and was blown away by how luscious and colourful and clever the film was in terms of just its technical filmmaking, quite separate to the great story that it tells. The Shape of Water, no pun intended, blows it out of the water. It is a gorgeous film from start to finish that lives in its own fairy tale sort of 60s-ish Art Deco-y world that plays with all sorts of crazy idioms, uses the time of day, light and sound to tell an astonishingly heartfelt moral story that is so important for today's politics. And it is the only film this year where you will see a lady masturbate to thoughts of a fish man. So there's that. I love The Shape of Water. It is an astonishingly good film, and it is so complete in terms of its approach and its ideas that even a 5-minute section that I totally hated does not detract from that film in any sense whatsoever. I'm not surprised at all that they're talking about this film getting a Best Film or Best Director nomination. I wouldn't be surprised if they won one of those at least. I think in some ways, the way that The Shape of Water dresses what is nevertheless a very real and very heartfelt theme about discrimination and otherness how it addresses that in a fantasy kind of world will really appeal to Academy voters. And also the film's self-conscious calling back to 1940s, 1950s, 1960s film will also, I think, entice the, let's say, slightly older Academy generation who maybe grew up with some of those films into voting for it as well. So thanks for listening to my slightly long chat about how much I love Guillermo del Toro and how cool The Shape of Water is. I hope you enjoyed my review, and if you've seen the film, please let me know in the comments down below what you thought about it. If you like the review, don't forget to click like and give me a subscribe if you haven't already to get the next one when it comes out. Have a good one. Bye for now.